Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is the second of a two-part City Talk special on election polling. There are good polls, bad polls, and just plain ugly polls. There are polls that enlighten, and there are polls that mislead, sometimes intentionally. Some polls recall Mark Twain's observation about lies, damn lies, and statistics. Others truly tell us what we the people are thinking. Joining me again to discuss polls, polling, and pollsters is Micheline Blum, Director of Baruch Survey Research at the Baruch College School of Public Affairs. Mickey is a founding partner of the highly regarded polling firm of Blum and Wepper and Associates. In a 30-year career, Mickey has polled for major local, national, and international media and nonprofits. She's also managed NBC News' polling and election operations. Welcome back, Mickey.
Thank you.
Last week we discussed error margins, sampling, question wording, question order, myths and cliches, sort of the basics of polling. Let's quickly review. What's a good poll, generally? What must a good poll do?
Well, it needs to start with a good sample. So it needs to start with a probability sample. Meaning that everybody has a chance of being included in this poll.
And that's no self-selection.
No self-selection.
You can't select yourself, the pollster has to.
The pollster has to select you, and whether it's your phone number and select you even when you're picking up the phone. Select the person in the household they want to speak to.
And if you don't have a random or probability sample, you've got a pseudo poll, a junk poll,
don't go any
garbage
further.
poll. Don't go any further.
It's
just entertainment. Read it
right.
and throw it in the garbage.
That's right.
Okay. What's a bad poll?
Oh, there's so many.
Right. We only have a half hour. Just give us a couple.
Well, a bad poll, for example, an internet poll.
Okay.
And an internet poll could be a reasonable poll of some things. But if you're talking about an election poll or a poll of the general population, then an internet poll really isn't a good
Explain
sample.
why. Explain why. And it's being increasingly used. You get on the net and there's all kinds of polling. Some by reputable polling organizations.
Because you're really, again, not getting a good probability sample of everybody. Not everybody is going to be on the internet. Not everybody is going to be as comfortable doing that kind of a poll. There is no way to sample the internet the way there is with phone numbers. There's no random digit sample of everybody's email, and not everybody even has an email.
Okay, so it's biased. The sample is biased. It's biased, obviously, people who own computers, who go online, and who are interested enough to do it.
Right, and even when they try to set up panels of people that they've recruited in some other way, the kind of people who get recruited into this kind of panel are not going to be a real probability sample of everybody. And once they're recruited into this sort of thing and are participating in poll after poll, again, they're really not typical anymore.
So avoid online polls. They may be good entertainment, but they're not.
Right, and they might be good for some things, but they're not good for this, for this kind of.
What else is a bad? Come on, let's do some bad things to avoid.
Robo-polls.
Okay, what's a robo-poll?
As they're called. The polls where a computer calls you and a computer speaks to you. First of all, the response rate on that is going to be very low, because an awful lot of people, the minute that it's some sort of computerized voice, are hanging up. So you're getting a much higher level of refusal. And the type of people who refuse you may be different. Also, now, If I'm speaking to a real person, chances are I'm actually going to have, try to give them real answers, or I'm not going to bother to go through this. Also, they'll know who I am at the other end of the phone. If I'm not pretending to be, a 90-year-old man, or something else.
It could be an 8-year-old.
It could be anyone.
It could be my
robopole.
German Shepherd.
I was going to say a robopole. Kids love them. If a kid answered the phone and it was a robopole, hey, what fun! I get to just push buttons and or just answer a question, and I can pretend I'm a grown-up. You don't know. You don't know that you've reached a business. You don't know all sorts of things. It's not the same as when there's an actual person on the other end of the phone. And,
so it violates your random sample argument that it's got to be a random phone number and it's got to be randomized within the household.
Right, and
so throw those away.
Exactly. You're not randomizing within the household here. You're just getting whoever's answering, and you don't even know it's a household, and you don't know whether they're lying.
And there are survey companies who are frequently quoted doing robopolls. For example,
lots of them.
Survey USA, for example, does national surveying with robopolls that's widely reported. Harris,
Absolutely.
for example, does the online survey that's
widely reported.
You're saying you got to watch it.
I would watch it. I won't say that they can never be right, but that doesn't.
But they're violating. They're violating the scientific principles.
Absolutely, and I'm much less trusting of those polls. I think that you have to be much more wary of what they're getting and what they're having to do to cook the numbers in order to get what they get.
And when you say cook the numbers in polling parlance, it's weighting the data.
Weighting the data. And you do have to be careful about weighting the data. It's appropriate to weight the data by things that are such as age and gender and
income
and income and things that you could find in the census where there are hard numbers for this and where these things don't change about you. I'm not going to wake up tomorrow morning and be 18. I am who I am. I might wish, but it's not going to happen.
Right.
So but I could wake up tomorrow morning and decide to change my party, or how I identify myself, or how I think of myself in terms of a party. Weighting by party ID is one of the things that polls do that they should not do.
And some of the most quoted practitioners of polling, for example, John Zogby weights by party ID.
Right.
And in a sense, aren't you arguing that you sort of predetermine the result by picking party ID?
Well,
also you're relying on history, that this is what happened in the past that's going to happen in the future.
There are a couple of things. Number one, this is something that changes, and it often changes depending on what's going on, and that's not being reflected in your poll because you're distorting it by weighting it out based on what you think should happen or what has happened in the past. Also, you are, in a sense, cooking the results by saying, if I wait by putting in, more Republicans or more Democrats, well, guess what? Then if I make this more Democratic, it's going to look like more Obama. If I make it more Republican, it's going to be more McCain. That's not appropriate.
Okay, what else should you avoid? I know we talk about this all the time. The averages of polls. Realpolitics.com has the average of the presidential horse race polls. Go ahead. I know this makes you apoplectic.
This is one of the things that drives me nuts. But many sites do it, and
they
average the polls. And there's a lot of problems with averaging the polls. The polls they're not all equal, as we were just saying. There are many differences in terms of what's good polls and bad polls. But also, some polls may be a poll of registered voters, and another poll is a poll of likely voters. And even among polls of likely voters, they may use very different ways of determining what's a likely voter. Or this poll was done for 3 days, and this poll was only done for 2 days, and there are lots of differences,
different sample sizes,
all sorts of things that are different.
Again,
you're doing an average of your apples and oranges and
roast beef and lamb chops.
And I don't know what you're getting.
Right.
And it makes no real sense. If you want to say this is what the polls in general have been looking like, then saying that there's this range of polls, the polls range from, and then giving sort of a low and a high, and perhaps even why a particular poll might be showing more Obama or might be showing more McCain makes a lot of sense, because in fact you might expect to see certain differences between registered voter polls or likely voter polls, or a poll that was taken during a convention or after a convention.
Okay. Push polls. What's a push poll and what's wrong with them? Because you see a lot of criticism of push polls by the major polling organizations like APOR, like the National Council on Public Polls. Go ahead.
Push polls aren't real polls. Let's start with that. The purpose of a push poll is not to find out information, which is the purpose of other polls. It's not to gather data, it's to disseminate information.
Okay, wait a minute. You're calling me up, I answer the phone, do a push poll for me, or give me the idea of a push poll.
The idea of a push poll is I'm going to try to give you a whole lot of negative information about a candidate, and then say, if you knew this, how would you feel about this person?
So they phrase it as if it's a poll.
Right. Now, it's perfectly legitimate to ask some of those kinds of questions on some real polls. But a real poll is actually done of a sample, of an appropriate sample, and it will ask you all sorts of other questions, like demographic questions and positive and negative questions about both candidates. And then report that. A push poll is only out there. It's probably going to ask you very few questions. They're going to all be negative, all in one direction, all against one candidate, and they're going to be asked of 50,000 people. Not because you want to report anything, but because you want to
influence.
You want to influence it, get a negative message out to 50,000 people.
Okay, so they're really thinly veiled accusations, and not sometimes not even thinly veiled accusations.
Often not.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got, in terms of the real ugly, throw them in the wastebasket or laugh at them polls, we have robo-polls, online polls, averages of polls, and push polls.
Yes.
Ignore them all.
Ignore them all.
Okay. You mentioned something about response rates. Response rates, meaning the people who actually consent to be interviewed, has been going down.
Yes.
And also, one of the problems with modern polling is the cell phone.
Yes.
Talk about response rates, the meaning of response rates, the importance of response rates, and cell phones.
Well, response rates have been going down for a number of reasons, not the least of which has to do with the fact that we're not as home as much. People have answering machines. They screen their calls. They have caller ID. They have cell phones. There's a lot of reasons why it's harder to reach people by phone, and our response rates are going down. And people got terribly annoyed by getting a lot of telemarketing calls. And so they became more wary of them, and so they were actually just refusing more. So that has been a problem. Luckily, up until now, even though response rates are lower, in fact, the accuracy of our polling and the accuracy of our sampling has been such that polling still works.
Okay.
And most telephone polls really do work. Cell phones are a whole new ball game for all of us, because even looking at a year ago, you're going to have something different from where we are now, because it keeps increasing. The number of people who use only a cell phone, who no longer have a landline phone, or even if they have a landline phone, really never use it.
My daughter and my son-in-law don't have a home phone. They have 2 cell phones.
Right. And even some people who have a landline phone actually never take calls on that. They have it as a backup. They have it as an emergency. They have it for some other purpose.
Okay, if you don't then survey cell phone users, what are you missing? What's the systematic bias here?
You may be missing certainly younger people, and that can matter perhaps this year more than in previous elections, because in previous elections we've always felt that if you missed, even if we knew we were starting to do worse and worse among young people voted the least, and it was not as big a factor. This year, because of the enormous interest in young people in the Obama campaign, you really can't afford to leave a lot of young people out. You're also leaving out more poorer people, minorities. There are certain groups who are also more likely to be cell phone only.
Okay. So if a poll does not include cell phone users, we've got to look at it with caution. It's not throw it in the garbage right away.
It's not throw it in the garbage, but there may be some slight lack of coverage here. So here it's not a non-response. It's sort of, there may be, when we talk about it having to include everybody and everybody having a chance to be included, if you're not including the cell phones, there's a group that you're not, that's being excluded, and that can be a problem.
Okay. There are a couple of kinds of polls that'll come into prominence now and certainly on Election Day. One is the tracking poll,
right,
and then on Election Day is the exit poll.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about tracking. Lots of polling organizations, particularly Gallup, most notably Gallup, does tracking poll. What is a tracking poll?
Well, a tracking poll means that they're polling every single day, but they're doing a rolling average. So what they're going to present on any given day is not just what they got yesterday, but what they got over the last 3 days.
Okay, so they start today. Mm-hmm. So they do 1, 2, 3 days of polls.
And that's what they're going to report the next day. The day after that, they're dropping what they got the first day and just taking the most
so
recent 3 days.
So it's a continuing
rolling
rolling
rolling average. And that actually is very helpful in watching the trends and whether, in fact, a particular candidate is moving up or moving down in the polls.
And you can also, I guess, see the impact of certain events, external events, over the course of time.
Absolutely, because you can also see if there's a particular spike on a given day that changes things.
I see the advantages of what's the disadvantages of a tracking poll? Are there any?
Well, first, it's very expensive to do, because now you're talking about polling day after day after day after day, and that truly is. I don't know that I would say that there are real disadvantages of it. I think it probably makes a great deal of sense if one can do it over those last periods. As we get toward the very end, we do see some changes, and it's the very last polls that are very close to the end that are likely to be the most accurate predictors of the final result.
But even then, I mean, even the polling up into the last day. I remember my first year that I worked for ABC News was 1980, which was the Carter-Reagan election, and the pre-election polling on the weekend before was close, real close, and then on Election Day, boom, it wasn't close.
It wasn't. And first of all, even if you poll really, really up to virtually the last day, there still can be change. People still may make up their mind in that last day. And there may be the people who decide that they will go out and vote on that last day, and the people who thought they were going to vote and stay home on the last day. So there are some changes that can happen right at the end that are very hard to predict, not because you did a bad job, but even the people themselves.
Right.
If you were to ask them, because you're asking them how they feel today, you're talking to them the Saturday before, and it's, if the election were held today, and that's what they believe on that particular day they're speaking to you. But things may change. There may be reasons why they
The
do.
caution that we all make to, our clients or our students is that a poll is only a snapshot of the day that it takes place.
And indeed it is. And it is not just because, for the pollster, but even for the person who's answering the phone. I can't tell you how I'm going to feel in a few days. I can only tell you what I think now, and if this were happening now, what I would be doing.
So the real mistake a lot of folks make is to treat these horse race polls as predictions when they're not at all.
They're not, although, clearly that is how people use them. And that's why, in fact, over time now, pollsters have gotten so that they poll right up until the last minute. We used to stop earlier on, and we've discovered, of course, because there are changes at the last minute, you really can't.
Well, I mean, the famous 1948 Dewey-Truman election, they stopped weeks in advance, predicted Dewey. The Chicago Tribune,
Right, and you
Dewey
really
wins.
can't. And you really can't. And as we said, even when you do everything right, it is possible that things will change.
Okay, so we got to the night before the election, then we come to election day, and then we talk. Then we have the exit polls, and you ran the exit poll operation for NBC, and I worked for ABC exit poll. Talk about that and the difficulties.
Well, it is
straight some war stories. Go ahead.
It's first of all, it's much more difficult than people really understand it, but it is. In fact, the one poll that is a poll of the actual people who voted on that day. So that part you've got. You've actually got the people who showed up. But even there, the people who decide to participate, because you approach, let's say you're approaching every third person.
Step back a second. Talk
Okay.
about how you sort of set up an exit poll, whether national or even an exit poll within a state, for example. Let's say New York State, for example.
There are all you get a sample of all the different polling places in the state, of all the voting precincts within the state, and you're going to sample from that. So first, so you're not going to be polling at every possible polling place, but only at some.
So you randomize the selection.
We're randomizing that selection. Then at the polling place, depending on how many people vote there,
based on historical
information and how many people are registered to vote at that spot, you are going to perhaps be approaching every person, perhaps every third person, perhaps every 10th person.
To get the right number.
To get the right number. Now,
that could be a problem.
That can be a problem. Even if you do your very best not to sort of pick the one you want from the group, because it's very important that, again, that you're picking this in such a way that everybody has the same chance of being included. So you are picking every 10th person and not just that person looks nice and approachable and that person doesn't. But even if, again, our pollster does everything right, our interviewer goes up and approaches the right person, the person who decides to take that poll or not take that poll, may be different. There may be a bias there, because we know that Democrats and that liberal voters and that younger voters especially are more likely to take the poll. Not to refuse.
Why?
To be willing to take the poll. They actually they often want to, and whereas conservative voters and older voters are a little more wary of it, they're a little more nervous about it, or they have, in the case of conservative voters, they may have some feelings about the media that make them feel that they don't want to participate.
So you always have to worry about an overstatement of Democratic support?
Well, it's not going to maybe be wildly overstated, but just enough so that it may make it, that it may change things and make Kerry look like he's doing better than he was.
Right.
Or in the case of the primaries, perhaps Obama look a little better than
he did in New Hampshire. Talking about Kerry, talk about the various waves. I mean, you're watching on TV, the exit polls, and the data comes in certain waves. Talk about what waves are and how that might affect.
Sure. The data comes in at different time, at different waves, meaning that they gets called in by this interviewer who has gone out and been doing all of this polling, and then they're going to call in at a particular time and report their results. Now, this is going to happen perhaps, say, 3 times in the day. Those waves, as they're called, of polls will not all be the same, because different kinds of people may vote earlier in the day or in the middle of the day or late in the day. And that, may depend on their age, on whether they're working people, on whether they're, housewives, whether they're parents of school kids, what kinds of jobs they have. Right, if they're retired.
So you can't rely on Wave 1 data.
Wave 1 data is just people who vote in the early part of the day. That's not everybody.
So that was the problem with Kerry, because a lot of the information gets leaked and everybody's looking at Wave 1 data thinking Kerry wins.
Well, also sometimes they're looking at data. Not only can there be an issue with the waves, but we're back to weighting again. It's totally unweighted, and it's just come in sort of total raw numbers, and you may not be getting, later on it'll be adjusted in such a way as to be a better reflection.
Okay, let's summarize. What do we avoid? What do we want? What do we avoid?
Well, we avoid anything that's not a good sample. That's not a probability sample, no matter what it is, no matter what kind of sample it is. You avoid biased questions. You avoid polls and pollsters who might have an agenda and a reason for wanting you to believe that
a hired gun pollster.
Yes, right, like that kind of thing. I think that's something to avoid. You have to be. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to know what to avoid if somebody's very clever at hiding certain things. So, for example, you may think you're getting a sample, a random sample from this poll, because they say they did a random sample based on a list.
Okay, so this really ticks you off. Okay, we got to stop now. We got to stop. I know lots of things tick you off. This has been the second of a 2-part City Talk on polling with Micheline Blum, director of Baruch Survey Research. Thanks. You'll be back before November, right?
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.